I offer you a little piece. Anybody want a piece of challah? Really, Israel? Okay.
All right. Well, recording has begun, and I invite Jennifer to begin with her presentation. Thank you. Please
Okay,
remain.
Previn told a little bit about me. I wanted to say that the reason I took this on was because I'm actually married to someone who is Mizrahi. I'm not Mizrahi. I'm an Ashkenazi, like 100%. My family is Latvia, Russia, and Austria. They all came to America. But my husband's paternal side are 100% Mizrahi Jews, and they migrated from the Middle East to Mexico. My husband was born and raised in Mexico. So anyway, that's just a little background. I sifted through a lot of videos on YouTube to try to give like a synopsis of the Mizrahis. And so I'm going to play those for you. They're short ones. I have two. They're really short to give you an idea of the geography and what happened over history and some differences, especially between the Mizrahis and the Sephardic, because most people kind of use those two terms interchangeably. And the videos will tell a little bit about that, and then I'll expand on it afterwards. So let me try to share here. Let's see. Is it going to let me do it? Let's see.
Brevin, did you co-host her?
Let me see.
Hang on.
She's okay.
I think it's okay.
You're okay.
I think so. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, she's fine.
Can you see my?
It says Zoom.
Yep.
Can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
Definitely avoid using this on your hair. In just
Okay,
2
well,
weeks,
first
it
we
made
have a
my hair
commercial.
grow like crazy.
Matzo ball soup and
Okay.
bagels. Do you
Can you
picture
hear?
a long string of numbers
Yes.
tattooed on a wrinkled forearm? Chances are, if you live in North America, your experience of Judaism has been pretty Ashkenazi, or European. After all, 66% of American Jews identify as Ashkenazi. But despite the cultural traditions built in the diaspora, Jews are indigenous to the Middle East. In fact, the term Jew comes from Judea, or Yehuda, the Iron Age kingdom whose artifacts lie just beneath the surface of modern-day Israel. In the 2nd century CE, Roman occupiers crushed the last hint of Jewish rebellion in the region. The subsequent Jewish exile lasted nearly 2,000 years, creating a far-flung Jewish diaspora. The Jews who made their way to Southwest Asia and North Africa became known as Mizrahim, Easterners. For centuries, these Middle Eastern and North African Jews lived and worked, prospered or suffered as guests in foreign countries, their fortunes linked to the whims of often unfriendly rulers. Like Jews around the world, Mizrahi Jews dreamed of returning to their ancestral homeland, directing their daily prayers toward Jerusalem. This dream became an urgent necessity as the Second World War inched closer to their borders. By 1941, the Nazi ideology that had consumed Europe made its way to the Middle East, violently. After a failed coup attempt, Iraqi fascists took their displeasure out on the country's Jews, murdering, maiming, raping, and looting in a rampage of violence known as the Farhud, Arabic for violent dispossession. Under the collaborationist Vichy government, North African Jews were stripped of their citizenship. Thousands were then deported to forced labor camps where they were horribly abused. By 1945, Europe was a smoldering ruin with its Jewish communities hollowed out. As shell-shocked refugees trickled into Palestine, the UN prepared to vote on a plan that would carve out 2 separate states, one for Jews and one for Arabs, from the tiny sliver of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. In response, Muslim countries from Egypt to Iraq vowed that if Israel came into existence, the region's Jews would suffer horribly. A New York Times headline from May 1948 summarized the situation aptly. Jews in grave danger in all Muslim lands, 900,000 in Africa and Asia face wrath of their foes. But Mizrahi Jews had a safe haven. True, their destination was a tiny, desperately poor country embroiled in a war against 6 much larger nations. And yes, it was bursting at the seams with refugees and survivors from all over the world. But it was also a place toward which Jews had directed 2,000 years' worth of prayers. And it was, and remains, the only country in the world that provides Jews with refuge, no questions asked. All told, nearly 600,000 Mizrahi Jews streamed into Israel between 1948 and 1972. Most were destitute, their property seized by the governments of their former homes. The total value of the assets stolen from Mizrahi Jews by Muslim governments is estimated to be worth $6.7 billion in today's dollars. But Mizrahi Jews who emigrated to Israel brought with them a different kind of wealth, that of a rich culture. They spoke Arabic, marked auspicious occasions with henna ceremonies, and read the Torah with lilting inflections. Uncomfortably for the Ashkenazi establishment, Mizrahi Jews bore a deep cultural resemblance to the country's highly unfriendly neighbors. Plus, many of the die-hard secularists in the government disdained the piety of the recent immigrants, who clung tenaciously to their religious traditions. As you might imagine, the transition to Israeli life was rocky at first. Millions of immigrants from all over the world stretched the state's meager resources. There wasn't enough money or room to house them all. So the new Israeli government created temporary transit camps made of corrugated tin called ma'abarot. Numerous government leaders described the ma'abarot's conditions as catastrophic. Though they were not built solely to house Mizrahim, 58% of the Jews who came from Arab lands before 1951 were sent to these overcrowded shantytowns, compared with 18% of those who came from Europe. The discrimination continued as the state matured, but so did Mizrahi resistance. Riots in 1959 eventually inspired a movement known as the Black Panthers, modeled after the American civil rights group of the same name. Slowly, Mizrahi figures became much more mainstream, strongly influencing Israeli culture. World-famous Yemenite-born singer Ofra Haza led Israel to a second-place victory at Eurovision in 1983. A year later, Iraqi-born Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, a hero to Israelis of all backgrounds, established a major political party called Shas to represent Mizrahi interests. Today, Mizrahi culture is almost synonymous with Israel. Turn on the radio, and you'll likely hear the silsulim and ma'awalim of traditional Mizrahi music transposed onto modern pop. Ask any Israeli about an iconic Israeli food, and they'll tell you malawach, not matzo balls. You'd be hard-pressed to find a Jewish Israeli of any background who hasn't attended a mimuna or a henna. Most notably, as of 2016, 20% of Israelis are half Ashkenazi and half Mizrahi. The country's European founders might not have imagined their country with over 50% Mizrahi. They may not have predicted Mizrahi politicians in the Knesset, mixed ethnicity families in every other house, or Mizrahi entertainers at the top of the charts. But in the words of writer Matzi Friedman, that we are free, safe from persecution, and in charge of ourselves, these things are new. But that we are here, in the Middle East, there is nothing new about that at all.
Okay, and I have one other one, also short, and then I'll get into my discussion. Let's see.
That was good, Jennifer.
This
Yeah.
one is more about the comparisons and differences and similarities of the Sephardic and the Mizrahi, because I think American Jews are most familiar with Ashkenazi or Sephardic and those terms. So this talks about that.
And some, like this.
Whoop. And let me back it up a
Or
little.
strimals, others wear jalabiyas. Some eat mufleta, while others eat bagels. Some Jewish music sounds like this. And some, like this. As Jews have spread out across the globe over the last 2 millennia, each community came up with a convenient shorthand. A label meant to answer the question, what kind of Jew are you? Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, Beta Israel, B'nai Menashe. But identities are more complicated than one-word labels, especially when 2 of these labels, Sephardic and Mizrahi, are often lumped together. So what do we mean when we talk about Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews? Sephardic is more than a geographic connection. No single word can ever fully capture all of the messy nuances of human identity, especially when people use the same words to mean vastly different things. Like Sephardic and Mizrahi. If you asked your average Jew to explain the difference,
let me explain.
Here's the oversimplified response they'd likely give.
Let me sum up.
Sephardic means from Sfarad, or Spain, and refers to Jews with roots in the Iberian Peninsula. Meanwhile, Mizrahi, or Eastern, is a catch-all meant to describe Jews from the Arab and Muslim worlds. But that's an oversimplification. Here's why. In terms of the meaning of the words, yeah, both Sephardic and Mizrahi refer to geography. Sephardic maps to Iberia. Mizrahi maps to some ambiguous place in the so-called East.
Can you be more specific?
But that's not all those words represent. Sephardic also refers to a school of thought, a specific worldview about how to observe Judaism.
Not just a place, but a state of mind.
For hundreds of years, Jews thrived in Iberia. New schools of Jewish philosophy came into being. Sephardic scholars like the Rambam revolutionized the study of Jewish law. At the same time, Ashkenazi scholars in Europe were compiling their own modes of studying Torah. The two schools split on many key points, and that is why Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews often follow different customs. So to be Sephardic meant to both be from Sfarad and to follow the specific Sephardic school of religious observance.
That's how we roll, dog.
But the Jews of Sfarad were not allowed to stay in the home where they had lived for centuries. By the late 14th century, Jewish life in Spain had become intolerable. The death blow for Sephardic Jewry came a century later, when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella decreed that Spain would be a Jew-free zone. Sephardic Jews fanned out across the world, taking their traditions and worldview with them. And there, Sephardic traditions influenced and mingled with existing Jewish customs. But some of these existing communities weren't always eager to mingle with the Sephardic refugees. Many communities were conscious of their differences. The Jews of Cochin, India, referred to their Sephardic neighbors as Paradesi, foreign. In Morocco, Sephardic Jews were known as Megorashim, the expelled. But it's the nature of people and cultures to mingle. So though some communities maintain separate identities and traditions, praying in separate synagogues and burying their dead in different cemeteries, some integration was inevitable. In fact, in some communities, Sephardic traditions became the new norm, and that's how some Jews with no Iberian heritage whatsoever came to be called Sephardic. Okay, you're thinking, I get it. Sephardic isn't just a geographic term. It's also a heritage, set of traditions, a community, and a school of thought. So what about Mizrahim? Well, Mizrahi is a recent term, and it's got some ugly roots.
Not this again.
Yes, this again.
The expulsion from Spain transformed global Jewry, bringing far-flung communities into contact with one another. 4.5 centuries later, another great migration rocked the Jewish world. That's right, I'm talking about the newly formed state of Israel that welcomed Jews from every corner of the globe. And though many flocked to Israel out of idealism, others came because they had nowhere else to go. Though Israel was established as a safe haven for world Jewry, Israel's founding fathers weren't entirely certain what to make of many of these immigrants. Most of the country's founders were Ashkenazi, or Jews who had lived in Europe, and they had a very specific conception of how their new country should look. Secular, socialist, and anchored in the European tradition. But ideals are one thing, reality is another. As immigrants from across the Middle East and North Africa poured into the Jewish state, Israel's founding fathers were forced to contend with the facts on the ground. By and large, these Jews weren't secular, they weren't socialist, and they had their own vastly different traditions. This is where the story gets ugly. See, to Israel's founding fathers, these Jews were all more or less the same. They didn't know or care that some Indian Jews were originally Sephardic and some were Malabari, that some Moroccan Jews spoke Hakatiya while others spoke only Judeo-Arabic, that Yemenite brides died in Tashbuk while Persian brides burned wild rue seeds to ward off the evil eye. Who had time to investigate these differences? The country was buckling under the weight of war and poverty. These new immigrants were Israelis now, but they needed a name to distinguish them from the other Israelis, the Ashkenazi ones, the ones that the founding fathers had envisioned. And the name the Israeli establishment came up with was Edot HaMizrach, communities of the East. Informally, Mizrahim, Easterners. But East depends on where you're standing, and that's because the term wasn't really about geography. It was just a nice sounding way to set up a binary between the Western, and therefore civilized Ashkenazi Jews, and the Eastern, or so-called primitive Jews. the term collapses all nuance, lumping Jews from countries as distinct as Iran and India into one catch-all category of not Ashkenazi. But today, most people, including some who identify as Mizrahi, don't know about the ugly roots of the term. And that's because it's been reclaimed, a proud political statement rather than a semi-slur. But the lines can get blurry, because some Israeli Jews who fit this definition of Mizrahi have continued to define themselves as Sephardic, as a nod to their religious views and traditions. And that's one reason why the terms Sephardic and Mizrahi get lumped together. But here's the wildest part. Far from being an oasis of European culture in the desert, Israel has become increasingly Mizrahi. And here's the third thing you need to know. Mizrahi culture has shaped Israel. It wasn't easy to be a Jew from Morocco or Yemen or Tunisia in Israel's early years. The Ashkenazi establishment suppressed and disdained Mizrahi culture. Mainstream radio stations refused to play Mizrahi songs. Few Ashkenazim would have been caught dead at a Mimuna, the post-Passover carb fest beloved by Moroccan Jews. Some Mizrahi brides even chose to forego the traditional pre-wedding henna ceremony, because those traditions were seen as embarrassing and uncool. But some Mizrahi youth refused to accept the status quo. Small pro-Mizrahi protests grew until 1971, when the most famous pro-Mizrahi movement sent shockwaves across the country. HaPanterim HaShochorim, aka Israel's Black Panthers. They marched in the streets to deliver a simple message. Mizrahi Jews deserve the same treatment and opportunities as their Ashkenazi brothers and sisters. HaPanterim weren't the first to demand equal rights for Mizrahim. Some activists and politicians had been advocating for better treatment of Mizrahim for decades. But the change was gradual. It wasn't until 1977 that the Israeli establishment felt the power of the Mizrahi vote. Prime Minister Menachem Begin managed to unseat the Israeli establishment in large part by appealing to Sephardic and Mizrahi voters. But the most prominent political revolution was the creation of the political party, Shas. Founded in 1984 by Israel's Sephardic chief rabbi, Ovadia Yosef, Shas proved to all of Israel that Sephardic and Mizrahi voters had significant clout. More victories followed, some obvious, others more subtle. Mizrahi music began to dominate Israeli airwaves. Mizrahi food gained prominence as Ashkenazi Israelis discovered the deliciousness that is kube, malawah, jahnun, and sabich, foods that are now synonymous with Israel. These days, most Israelis, regardless of background, have attended at least one Mimuna, the traditional Moroccan party that celebrates the end of Passover with a food coma of delicious carbs. Pre-wedding henna ceremonies have become increasingly common too. And Israeli movies and TV have gotten a lot of mileage out of portraying the culture clash between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, exploring the differences and similarities with warmth, humor, and song. And the term Mizrahi, with its painful roots, it's been reappropriated by Israeli Jews whose families came from Iran and Morocco and Syria and Afghanistan, a celebration of their cultures rather than a veiled insult. But the term isn't necessarily widespread outside of Israel. And that brings us to the fourth thing you need to know about Sephardic and Mizrahi identities. They sometimes overlap. Ready for an example that's gonna make your head spin? Picture this for a second. It's 1952 in Damascus. Things are not great for Jews living in Syria. The Cohens with zero Iberian heritage get on a boat to New York City. Meanwhile, the Gabbais, who do trace their lineage back to Spain, sneak over the border to Israel. Within a decade, the Cohens, who I remind you have no Iberian heritage, have become American Sephardic Jews, while the Gabbais now identify as Mizrahi and Israeli.
Say what? My head is spinning.
See, Jews who immigrated to Israel from Arab or Muslim countries were defined and named by the mostly Ashkenazi Israeli establishment. But Jews who emigrated to other countries that were not majority Jewish, they had to negotiate new ways to define themselves. And the many Jews who settled in America or Argentina or France became Sephardic, even if they had no Iberian roots. Remember, Sephardic is more than just a geographic connection. And that's why a Jew from Aleppo living in Israel might call himself Mizrahi, while his brother living in France might define himself as Sephardic. Is your head spinning yet? Look, identities are messy. Labels are far more complicated than they appear. Our identities are shaped in part against a wider society, a constant tug of war between how we define ourselves and how others define us. But here's the thing that I think is most important. We're all one people. People love to label and categorize and pin down. It's human nature, and labels can be helpful. They tell us how a person sees themselves in the broadest strokes. Are you religious or secular, left-wing or right-wing? But humans aren't made up of broad strokes. We're like pointillist paintings, infinitely detailed and nuanced. The more you zoom in, the more complex we become. And the more useless our labels. In a world where Ashkenazim and Mizrahim and Sfaradim marry and mix and mingle, do these labels still have a value? Every person has to answer that question for themselves. But here's my take. It's important to know where you come from, to be rooted in your family's traditions. But we should never forget that we're part of a much larger family that has survived against all odds. Because what really matters is that we're all reunited at last.
Why?
Okay, let's see. And I'm just going to note also that gentleman that was speaking, he's mostly Mizrahi and part Sephardic and a couple other little things in between. And you can see also that his skin's darker. I was going to show you a picture of my husband too. See if I can get it. And his dad. So his dad's 100% Mizrahi Jewish, and then my husband's half. His mother actually is half Spanish and half French, and they're Catholic. But he favors his dad, as you can see. So let's see. I'm going to stop sharing. And let me change this here. Okay. Let me just get my notes. Does anyone have any questions before I continue, or go ahead, Sheila?
Yeah, it sounds like they're using the Mizrahi and Sephardic is almost interchangeable, even though Sephardic originally came from Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, and the Mizrahis came from the East. Now, saying East is very vague.
Right.
I had two friends when we lived in California who married Moroccan Jews.
Uh-huh.
Now, they just referred to themselves as Jews, but they went to a temple that had the bima in the middle, so it was more a Sephardic temple. They were more religious. They were also, one of them, I remember the wife told me, and she was a Ashkenazi Jew from Boston, that he had never seen a bathroom, an indoor bathroom, till he came to America.
Wow.
The other one got himself real educated and is currently a professor. So, they were vastly different. The one who hadn't seen the bathroom was a truck driver.
Hmm.
So
Probably,
really, but they were obviously from Morocco. I would say they're Mizrahi, right?
Yeah, I would. I mean, unless their family went to Spain for a while and came back to the Middle East, then they might be both. But
Yeah.
I would call them Mizrahi. Like for me, I'll just go off on an aside. A lot of the times when people see my last name, they'll say, in America, they'll say, "Oh, Mizrahi, you're Sephardic." And I used to say, "Well, it's my husband's last name, but yeah, he's Sephardic." But then their next question was almost always, "So does he speak Ladino?" Especially if they spoke Ladino themselves, because Ladino is the language of the Spanish Jews, basically, of the Iberian Jews. And then I would have to say, well, no, actually, he's a Mizrahi Jew. His father spoke Hebrew and Arabic. So to me, it's really different. Like being a Middle Eastern Jew your whole life in the Middle East, you didn't speak Ladino. You spoke the languages of the Middle East. You spoke Hebrew, Arabic, or sometimes a dialect of of the country you were in, or a dialect of like a Jewish dialect of Arabic sometimes.
So I
So
assume the Yemeni Jews spoke Arabic.
yeah.
probably I would assume. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I have my Jewish heritage is Middle Eastern, so I guess I'm
Uh-huh.
my Sephardi friend, though, when I told her she goes, "Oh my God, you're one of us." Right?
Right.
Considered. The other thing I'd want to say, ask you, what do you think
King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella would be doing now if they knew that Christopher Columbus was a Sephardi Jew, right? They kicked all the Jews. So
One of the
David is waving his
expelling them.
hands, trying
David
to
has his
speak.
hand up.
David,
But
My
let me just
experience-
ask,
Sure.
I'm sorry. I was just going to ask you though, since you're probably a Mizrahi Jew, but you don't identify that way. So like if you were
no,
asked
because
that.
I didn't grow up Jewish, because this is
Oh.
sort of attenuated. The family was broken up in the 19th century. So,
Gotcha.
but I traced myself to Iran.
Yeah,
Genetic.
there's a lot of Mizrahi. My last name happens to be Mizrahi, my husband's last name, but not all Mizrahi Jews have the last name Mizrahi, obviously. Yeah. So there's a lot of Mizrahis, though, that surname in Iran, or were in Iran. Now they're
Yeah.
out, but yeah.
So I
Anyway,
don't know what the
David.
surname is, but David.
Yeah, David has his hand up. So, David, go ahead, please.
So aside from the famous fashion designer named Mizrahi,
Yeah.
who just went by one word, my experience growing up, my father's Viennese, and Germanic Jews also did not want to be associated with the Jews of the East, and so whether to be labeled Ashkenazi, but then be grouped in, well, you know, we're the, you know, the, I don't know what term you want to use for the Germanic ones versus the ones that came from the Pale. And then so many of those Jews, when they came to the United States, just like Disraeli, they converted to Protestantism in order to advance in the United States and not deal with the hassles, especially if they were in government.
Oh, that's interesting. I think it depended when they came, you know, most of the Jews in the US, we're going off on a tangent a little bit, but most of the Jews in the US came before World War II or during that time, you know, and then most of the Israelis came after the Holocaust to Israel, you know, so it's also different mindset, different group of people, a lot, you know.
Well, the poorer Jews came in the turn of the century before the Prussian, Franco-Prussian
Yeah.
War, whatever, and those are the ones that went to the Lower East Side, as opposed to the ones that were before World War II. Those are who escaped, who had the money and the means. They all went to the big cities, and my father even took a Dale Carnegie course to try and lose his accent.
Yeah, interesting. So I'll continue with my presentation. That's interesting,
please.
actually. Hopefully, if we have time, you know, I'm interested in everyone's backgrounds and everything and experience. So anyway, the videos kind of touched on the term Mizrahi and why it was created. Is basically, like we were saying, differentiating between the Jews from Europe, basically, well, not Iberian Peninsula, but the rest of Europe, and other Jews. So Middle Eastern, parts of Africa. He mentioned the Indian Jews, which usually aren't included in with Mizrahi Jews. Some people do include it, but India also has some of its own designations. I don't know a lot about that, but they were pretty localized, like most Jews in countries, in certain cities, and have their own terms that they use. The only one I know is like Cochin or Coquine, something like that. That's interesting, but sometimes they're included with the Mizrahi designation. Let's see, the Mizrahi Jews, they kind of touched on this in one of the videos also. Ashkenazi Jews tend to say we're Reform or conservative or Orthodox. And the Mizrahi Jews I know, it might be changing now, but especially like when I think of my father-in-law, they were just Jewish. I mean, they were basically observant Jews. They weren't necessarily like super Orthodox. I mean, they're kind of like somewhere between conservative and Orthodox, I would say. That might be changing more now. But they, you know, kept kosher at home and observed a lot of the holidays. And sometimes they would cheat a little on the outside. But mostly they were observant and religious. Let's see, what else? And also terminology, a lot of terms have been thrown out there. So you might hear Mizrahi Jews, and synonymous to that would be Mizrahim, Arab Jews. That's another, still sometimes used with called Arab Jews, Middle Eastern Jews, Eastern Jews, and sometimes they used to use the term Oriental Jews. Although I think that's kind of out of favor now. Languages, so we were talking about that also. They spoke Hebrew. A lot of them spoke Arabic, and some were like the dialects of Arabic or other languages in those countries. So, for instance, one example would be in Iraq, they spoke Mosul, which was a dialect of Arabic, and there's still a few people that speak it, but it's dying out. A lot of those dialects are dying out. You might have that hear it in generations like someone's grandmother, but it wasn't really passed down much. Whereas opposed to the Ashkenazi Jews spoke Yiddish. There were some dialects within Yiddish too, but even if they were from different countries, Yiddish was kind of this common Jewish language across Europe, where the Mizrahi Jews don't really have that. It's more broken up. They have their own little dialects or different languages. Let's see what else. They talked about how the Mizrahi Jews wound up back in Israel. A lot of the Mizrahi Jews were Zionists themselves. They, dreamt of going back to Israel. Some of them left, because their countries became really inhospitable to Jewish people. They were stripped of citizenship or, just very high anti-Semitism. So that's part of what brought them to Israel, even sometimes, before Israel was created, back to the lands of Palestine. So my father-in-law's, just to bring some personal stuff to it, my father-in-law's family, they actually, when they migrated to Mexico, that was in the 30s, when anti-Semitism was really heating up. His family was originally from like Syria, Lebanon area, and then down into Palestine, or what is now Israel. And then they migrated to Mexico. And there's quite a big, quote unquote big, there's a, you know, Sephardic and Mizrahi population in Mexico. So when I say big, it's not really that big, but proportion wise, here in America, the Ashkenazis really are so present, as opposed to in Mexico, it's more evenly split. Let's see what else. So they kind of touched on also, we've touched on the differences between Mizrahi and Sephardic. And, there's really no rule about using the right term or the wrong term. But like I said, I feel like my husband is a Mizrahi Jew, not a Sephardic Jew. They didn't live in Spain, the family, they don't speak Ladino, but the Mizrahi Jews are kind of like a subgroup of the Sephardic, like the rabbis and stuff. It's kind of, I don't know how to explain that really, but it's kind of like a subgroup when they look at leadership in Judaism. Let's see. So I just have some notes here to make sure I don't miss anything. Oh, customs and traditions. So I think that's really cool about the Mizrahi customs, traditions, their food. So the food, like my father-in-law grew up on basically what we would consider Mediterranean food. He was eating kibbeh and tabbouleh and hummus, and that was all that's what he grew up on. That was Jewish food to him. There wasn't matzo ball soup or gefilte fish or anything like that. That's very European. And for Passover, the Sephardic and the Mizrahim, they can still eat legumes and corn and rice on Passover. So I always say the food's better, easier. As much as I love a matzo ball soup. And I love that they have that big carb fest when Passover is over. They have this big party where you can just pig out on carbs because you've been eating like matzah for 8 days. They have, as far as dance goes, like belly dancing is a common thing in Mizrahi celebrations. Just like you know, you would see in Arab culture, the henna ceremonies. I think they talked about that. What else do I have here? Oh, statistics. So some statistics you might be interested in. 40 to 45% of the people in Israel are Mizrahi. 55 to 60% of the Jewish people in Israel are Mizrahi. So the majority of Jews in Israel are Mizrahi Jews. And according to a Pew poll here in the United States in 2020, 1% of Jews in the US identify as Mizrahi, just 1%. And Sephardic was only like 3%, really low on that poll. And another thing I wanted to point out about Israel is that over 80% of the Jews in Israel were actually born in Israel. So the majority of people in Israel now were born and raised in Israel. So I was going to touch on also race. So as far as Americans or in the United States, most people view Jews as white. And that's because the majority of us are from Europe. We present as white, I guess you would say. And even on the US Census, we would be categorizing ourselves as white. Even Middle Eastern Jews, Middle Eastern countries, West Asian countries in the US Census are categorized under white or Caucasian. So my husband lists himself as Mexican or Latin American. That's like the ethnicity on the US Census, and then white because of his background, Spanish, basically Spanish, Israeli, and French. But Mizrahi Jews really look like Arabs, you know, they in terms of skin color and you know, hair and all of that, they have darker complexions, generally speaking, not always. And so in our today's terms in the United States, those would be brown people. That's the word I hear thrown around a lot. Now, of course, on the US Census, we don't have the category of brown. And interestingly, the census is going to change in 2030 if it doesn't change again by the time it's published. But I saw some of the new how they're going to do it now. And they're not going to separate out ethnicity and race anymore. They're just going to list like they're adding Middle Eastern, which has never been on there before. And it's just going to say like white, black, Hispanic, Middle Eastern, you know, all those categories. And you just check as many that fit you. So that might change how the census is. But the reason I bring up race, and this is a tough one, I think, for Jewish people too, because I don't think we really think of being Jewish as being a race. You know, we don't think that way anymore. A few might, because you know, there's always Jews that disagree, or you know, we always have our arguments or whatever. But in today's world, politically, in the politics right now, and regarding Israel too, there's this kind of dialogue or a narrative that of the like kind of the white oppressor or the white what's the word the people who colonize countries. When it comes to Israel, that's a big discussion right now. And it's also very usually put into race categories. The white person coming in and harming the brown people or something like that. But more than half of Israel is brown, according to how we define it in the United States. That whole race thing, Israel is one of the most diverse places, you know, in the world, has a lot of diversity. So just something to think about when you think about the anti-Semitism that we're seeing in the country and how people just kind of think of us one way, and we're really much more diverse than people realize, I think. And I don't think race should be brought into it at all, personally, when it comes to those political things. Also, I was going to talk about marriages. It used to be that the Mizrahi and the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi kind of like stayed in their own groups. Even in America, it was kind of a thing, like among the Orthodox. If someone that was Sephardic or Mizrahi married to an Ashkenazi person, because their traditions are different, that happened. A woman who worked for me, she was Sephardic and she was Orthodox, modern Orthodox. And she married a guy that was Ashkenazi. And it was kind of like a thing, to have those two groups married together. But now in Israel, they intermarry all the time, and very common for someone to be half Mizrahi and half Ashkenazi. So that's really common now. And I guess that's it. Like, that's all I had really to kind of throw out there. And then if anyone had any questions, I hope I can answer or give you my opinion. So, Sheila, go ahead.
A lot of questions. First of
Sheila,
all, is there such
Sheila, wait a minute. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Jennifer. And
You're welcome.
in the meantime, I had spoken to Manny, if you remember, Sheila. Manny said
Yes.
a few words. Manny, make yourself appear and tell us. You have 3 minutes to tell us everything that you know about Mizrahi Jews.
I'm going to wait. Before you do that, if I don't write down my questions, I'm going to forget them.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm not going to give a whole other speech and compete with Jennifer. That's her job. But I'll say a few things. First of all, Jennifer, both of your videos were from Unpacked, which I recommend to people. It's a great YouTube site. Ruth has used it on occasion on Saturday also. On Shabbos. I'm saying Saturday because I'm thinking Yiddish. On Shabbos, for Friday. So that's a great site. And another really good source of information on Mizrahi Jews, which is largely a community of Mizrahis, is something called Jimina. Do you know about that, Jennifer?
I don't know. I don't think so. Go ahead. I'm happy to learn.
It's the place for Jimina. Jimina stands for Jews Indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. So they're avoiding the term Mizrahi, but it's the people that we're calling Mizrahi. There are 2 ways to access it, and they're complementary. It's not exactly the same info. They've got a Facebook site. I know some people don't like to be on Facebook, and you can also sign up for their e-newsletter. That's for people who really want to learn more and communicate with people from those communities who are very much into their culture. Unpacked is good for like our group tonight, for people who know very little, and you get a quick introduction. Jimina is a combination of some stuff that's reaching out to people who don't know, and it's also a lot of discussion among people of that community who care about that community and are many of them are quite knowledgeable. And of course, we're calling it one community, but we're throwing together so many different things as Jennifer mentioned, and as was mentioned on Unpacked. These are people from all these different countries with different cultures. What they have in common, and this is also in common with the Sephardim, and that's part of the reason some people use the term Sephardic to cover all of this, is a certain way of prayer. So among the religious people, there's the Sephardic approach and there is the Ashkenazic approach. That's what they have in common, but the cultures are quite different. And there's some variation in the food as well. And of course, I'm talking about in the countries that they came from. And as was pointed out in one of the videos, there are virtually no Jews left in the Arab countries. They were kicked out. they were kicked out or forced out, or things were so terrible they had to leave. There are a small number of Jews in the Persian country, Iran, but it's still a tiny part of the community. So if you want to know more, see more unpacked videos. So Jennifer picked my favorite YouTube site for people who start off not knowing too much, and also it's very entertaining. It's light. And if you want to know more than that, go to Jimina on Facebook and their e-newsletter. If you Google Jimina, both will come up. And
When you search,
another time I'll give maybe give a talk on Mizrahim that's a little more detailed. I'll say one more thing. For a long time, and it may still happen, our committee, the Jewish Journeys Committee, has been thinking of putting on a Memuna, which comes right after Passover.
Yeah.
That's why you're eating all the carbs, because you're eating the stuff that was forbidden. You're eating all the chametz. And they also have another holiday that was not mentioned in the videos or by Jennifer, and that is a Seder that is part of Rosh Hashanah.
Yep.
They have a Rosh Hashanah Seder. Do you know about that, Jennifer?
No.
Okay. So I'm thinking, we CHA like to eat food and learn a little culture while we're doing it. So that's another opportunity to do that. And with that, I will sign off.
If you search for Gemina, don't you find a pancake mix and syrup?
They changed the
Only if
name.
you have an aunt.
They changed the name to the something like somebody joked it was the slave owner's name. You know, the mill,
There's
the
an
Pearl
issue
Mill.
about that. It's not Aunt Jemima.
No, it's Pearl Mill or
Jimina.
something.
Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa.
Really
I
has
thought it
If
was
their
just
anybody
your
here
hand.
really
accent.
wants to learn, that's the place to go.
Thank you.
But,
Thank you.
Thank
but
you
it, as
very much.
usual, is very entertaining. Yeah.
Great.
As usual, Manny, you are very informative. Thank you very much for that. And Sheila is waiting with an abated breath to ask her question.
Well,
So,
let Relly go first because I'll hit her up later.
what's that?
Well,
Let
Manny
Relly
might
go
be able to
first.
help me. Go ahead.
All right, Jennifer.
Let Relly go. Go ahead,
Okay.
Relly.
Sheila, thank you. Jennifer, thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's very important for us to remember that American Jews and Reform Jews and Ashkenazi Jews are not the only Jews, even though numbers-wise, they're probably, we're up there. I think I'm probably the only one here that grew up in Israel and grew up with Mizrahim, with Faradim, and with Ashkenazim. And my family, as you alluded to, has got everything. We've got Moroccans, we've got Iraqi, we've got Russians, we've got, Africans, we've got all sorts of people in them. One thing maybe to clarify about the difference between Sephardic and Mizrahi. And you're right in what you were saying that initially, years ago, everybody was referred to as Sephardim. And then at one point, people started to make a distinction. And the distinction is really, it's very fluid because there are people that, there are always people that don't fall into one category or another. But broadly speaking, people came out of Spain and Portugal. The Iberian Peninsula is referred to now as Sephardim. But those people could come from Belgium, from France, from England, from Poland, from a lot of them from Turkey, from Italy, from Turkey to Syria, because in 1492 and afterwards, the Jews sort of from Spain, they went to North Africa. Somebody mentioned the Rambam. Rambam ended up in Egypt. But they're still considered Sfaradim because of their ancestry. The Mizrahim are people come from Arab countries, and that includes North Africa because the Arabs were in North Africa. So it's really the identity is the culture that the ancestors come from, not which sometimes typically correlates with geographically, but not always. It's very fluid in this respect. So I just thought, because people asked about it, to sort of try and clarify it. There is one issue that I have to pick up with the videos, that they were okay. You know, they're made for popularity and for, you know, so the accuracy is sort of, you know, sounds good. But one thing that I have to take issue, because it's personal to me, and that is this thing about the Mizrahim and the Ma'abarot. Everybody who came to Israel in the first few years went to Ma'abarot. That's it. It didn't matter where you came from, because they had nowhere else to put them. And I and my family came to Israel from Europe. We are Ashkenazim. We were put in a Ma'abarot, just like everybody else. Where there is a truth is that the Mizrahim ended up staying in the Ma'abarot longer than the Ashkenazim. And the answer to that is very complex. It's not as simple as, oh, the Ashkenazim were privileged. Did they get some preferential treatment? Yes, but by and large, Ashkenazim tried to get out of the Ma'abarot, whereas this, what we called at the time Sfaradim, but they were Mizrahim, they were quite content to be there. And if you read what they wrote years ago, years later, belong to the time that they used to be in the Ma'abarot, because they had chavruta, they've got companionship, they really loved. Now politically, it's a correct thing to say, you know, Begin started this sort of thing of trying to build a divide, and it's still sort of, you know, is out there. So it's not that there's no truth to it, but as somebody who went to Israel and was in the Ma'abarot, I don't want to negate my experience and my family's experience with expenditure because of politics. So I just thought I'll clarify that. But you're right now. But also, by the time that I grew up, there was very little discrimination at my age. Our parents' generation, yes. But there are people that have an interest of continuing that sort of divide. And I'm not going to get into Rabbi Sadia, you know, and they held in the videos. I'll just say one of the most famous things that he said was, a man that sits between two women is a donkey.
Relly, I have a question before you sign off. What is the significance of the Shas party today?
You know, I'm not really an expert on the different religious parties. They are important, all these parties, because their leadership listens to their rabbis. So before they make a political decision, before they will say yes or no to Bibi or to anybody, they go to the rabbis, and the rabbis tell them what to do and what not to do. And Shas is, you know, Israel is, you know, the government is made out of coalition. And therefore, the small party, and Shas has got, I think, about 6 or 7 or 8 seats, something like that. The small parties have a lot of leverage, because without them, without each one of them, the government can't exist. They can't have a majority. Shas, like many of the other religious parties, are more interested in the money than in anything else. And they are led by somebody called Derry, who cannot serve as a minister because of his criminal past. That should tell you.
Thank you, Kelly.
You asked.
Great. Yep. Thank you very much, Riley. Appreciate it.
Okay, can I give my questions now?
Go right ahead, Sheila.
Okay, is there a special Mizrahi shul just for Mizrahi sect, or would they go to any shul?
And that's a good question for the woman from Israel. If that, I mean, in
Really?
America, I don't think they're separate, right? In Israel,
No,
are they?
the Syrian Jews have their own synagogues. They don't
Mm.
even like to intermarry with anybody that is
Right.
I
a
have a
Syrian
great
Jew.
niece who married a Syrian Jew, and it made life
Iraqis,
miserable.
I mean, yeah. I mean, they typically go to their own synagogues, but they will cross over, whichever is closest or whatever. But each community has their own little synagogue, but they will cross over.
Well, I will
You know,
say,
if it's convenient for them.
what little I know, my husband, like I said, he's from Mexico. There's a lot of Syrian Jews there, like a community of them. And I would say that the Jews in Mexico, it might change now because my husband left Mexico a long time ago. But back then, I always say the Jews were very clannish in Mexico. Like when his father came to America, he was like, it's so different here. But also because we have Reform Jews and we're very intermingled in society, whereas there, they're in a predominantly Catholic country and it's a very religious country, so it's different. But they did seem very clannish. So just because they live, if you have to walk to synagogue, then if you're in a neighborhood that's Syrian Jews, then you're going to be going to that synagogue, right? So, yeah.
And what language do they speak in for and what language do they pray in? Do they pray in Hebrew?
Well, I can speak for my father-in-law. He prayed in Hebrew, and at home, his first languages and the home language was Hebrew and Arabic. And then because he lived in Mexico, he learned Spanish on the outside, but his parents, his parents were fairly fluent in Spanish, because they worked in Spanish, but they were never, they always had a heavy accent and they kind of a broken Spanish, so yeah. And the communities, like they would call like Ashkenazi Jews, they would say, oh yeah, the Russian Jews, even if they were Polish. I mean, I have a friend who's a Mexican Polish Jew, like, so yeah, they were kind of separated.
I remember when my kids went to Hebrew school, I remember the rabbi said, you can go anywhere in the world and go into any synagogue, and the prayers are the same, and you will understand it. And that's complete and utter bull.
Oh, because of the different, you mean
It's
the different dialects?
absolutely not true.
Well, the Hebrew, I mean, it's all in Hebrew, right? Isn't it?
Yeah,
It just might sound differently. So the
You
intonation
go
is
into
different.
Reform, you're hard pressed to hear Hebrew.
Well,
in the Reform, the prayers are in Hebrew, even though they might add English to it. But
right.
in all the synagogues, they pray in Hebrew. But I'll tell you something because you asked. When CHJ, I don't know if there anybody here who remembers when we started to read from the Torah, Andrew and I. And we decided to do the Hebrew because it sounds authentic, but also do it with the English translation. And we thought we were very original. Never heard of anybody doing it. And then I discovered that the Yemenite Jews used to do the same thing, except that they used to translate the Hebrew to Aramaic or to Arabic, in their services. But in a lot of services, if they, Jews would speak Aramaic in Syria, in parts of Iraq, they actually spoke Aramaic until fairly recently.
Yeah,
Long after
that's
people
true.
thought that the language was dead, they were still speaking that. In other parts, they spoke Judeo-Arabic, they spoke Ladino, they spoke Yiddish, but Hebrew
There's
was...
I think they speak Aramaic and Sudan too, Aramaic.
There's a guy on YouTube, Tal. I don't remember his last name, who does a lot of YouTubes, and his family is Iraqi, Jewish. And he's one of the ones, his grandmother speaks that dialect I talked about, actually. But and some of his grandparents or something spoke Aramaic, as you brought up. And he talks about his family having to leave Iraq. I think it was in the 50s, but I'm not sure. Because Iraq was stripping Jews of their citizenship and basically expelling them out of the country. And at the time, Iran helped the Jews from Iraq, helped them get out. And his family went to Israel. Then that's
So
when they
his
went.
family was from Iraq. Well, there was a route that they would sneak out of Iraq in the middle of the night to Iran, across the water to Iran, and from Iran to either London if they have money, or United States, and if they didn't have money, typically to Japan.
Makes sense. Yeah. Wow. Interesting.
By
Incredible.
by the way, in the 50s and 60s, the Shah of Iran was also benevolent to the Jews.
Yeah, actually, that's right. Actually, it was in 50s and 60s. You're right.
Yeah. And in 70s, it started to change.
Oh, everything changed for everyone in Iran in the 70s. Horrific.
Well, no,
I actually lived.
We're not talking about 78. I'm talking about
before that.
Before.
Around at the time of the first oil embargo, that's when it started to change. But before then, it was relatively safe for the Jews to live in Iran. Okay.
Yeah, actually, I lived in Iran during that period. And yes, I lived in the Jewish part of Esfahan, Iran. And I hope all my friends got out.
And by the way, there is a beautiful synagogue. It's a rather large synagogue in Tehran. And that was written up in the New York Times right around the time when the COVID started, within a couple of months of the COVID, maybe 3 or 4 months after COVID started. It was a beautiful article. And it said a lot of things about the Jewish community in Tehran at that time. So anyway, I'm going to take a minute over here and address the issue of race. I was surprised to hear Jennifer mention race in Israel. That to me was more than a surprise, it was a shock. Well, I'm reading from the book of H.G. Wells, if anybody is familiar with it. He wrote this book, a a short history of the world. It's very interesting, and he distilled a lot of things into very short narrative, which is something I find very interesting. Here it is that he's writing here. In the primitive Neolithic civilizations, we have to remember that human races can all interbreed freely, and that they separate, mingle, and reunite as clouds do. Human races do not branch out like trees with branches that never come together again. It is a thing we need to bear constantly in mind. This remingling of races at any opportunity. It will save us from many cruel delusions and prejudices if we do so. People will use such a word as race in the loosest manner and base the most preposterous generalizations upon it. They will speak of a British race or of a European race, but nearly all the European nations are confused mixtures of brownish, dark white, white, and Mongolian elements. This is what science tells us. So anytime when someone mentions race, I tell them to be careful, because scientifically there is no definition of race.
Yeah, the reason I brought that up is because of my concern about people putting the discussion of Israel and what's happening there. And the justification, the justification of a Jewish state, or that they feel that we shouldn't have a Jewish state, whatever, whoever you talk to, it varies. Some of them put it into racial terms, and that really troubles me. And
Classifying Jews as a race?
there
Not just
are
not just Jews, but within
distinguishing
Jews.
between two different groups, like
They're
the
not-
Sephardi are brown, but the Ashkenazi are white.
they're not doing that.
They're not.
No, what they're saying is, I'm talking about Americans.
Oh yeah,
Americans are calling Jews white.
Right.
Like the ultra progressive, let's say, are calling Jews white, and I'll give you for instance, like a very casual, for instance. I watch The View a lot, and Sunny Halston on The View, not that she's some sort of, like say everything matters what she says, but she's saying what a lot of people are saying. She is Hispanic and Black, and supposedly part Jewish too, like a quarter or an eighth Jewish on one side, And what she says, I see the Palestinians who look like me, and she means dark, and that the Israelis are the bad white people. This is
Oh
the
my
type of
God.
thing she's putting into, basically saying all Jews are white. And you know what I'm saying? So not all Jews are white, and I agree with Previn that, I'd rather not talk in terms of race, like whatever, but this is how other people are talking. And this is part of how they see Israel is how they see it, because of how they define us as white. That's part of the dialogue in their head.
Jennifer, can I add to what you were saying?
Please.
Basically, it's part of this anti-Semitism. When being black was a negative thing, when being dark was a negative thing, Jews were described and referred to as being black and dark. Now that being white is a bad thing and being black and brown is a good thing, all of a sudden Jews are white. So whatever society deems is the bad of today, this is what Jews are. So we're like a chameleon. We change our color depending on the wind of anti-Semitism.
Well,
that's exactly right.
I mean, race is really just a factor of where your deep ancestors grew up, lived, right? If you lived in Africa, you had darker skin. If you lived in Scandinavia, it's all biology. And I guess Ruth can probably say that more eloquently. But
like, what Previn said, like there's really no race, basically, is what he said. Like, we're all the human race, right? Well, in realistic terms of how, what we have to deal with in politics today, or how things are discussed in America today, race is part of the description. I mean, the same people, and I'm not saying Previn would say this, but a lot of the same people who will say, that there's no race or race shouldn't matter, use that term brown. I never even heard the term brown until maybe 10 years ago. I didn't even, except for that one article, like way back in the 80s, The Browning of America, like I had never even heard that. So I just think race is being used against us in a way with how people think about the Jews. And Hitler did it, and now it's being done in another way, So that's why I brought it up.
You mentioned the coming population census.
Yeah.
Is it going to be multiple choice?
Yeah. What's going to be interesting? If they keep it, you can Google about it. If they keep it and actually publish it, how I recently read.
That's crazy.
It's a multiple choice. So, but a lot of people don't read instructions, so they might just choose one, right? In fact, I'll use race again. Most white people who I know, when I tell them Middle Eastern is white on the census, like in 2020, 2010,
they probably
it's
freak
white.
out, right?
They don't even know. Like they're totally oblivious to that. So it will be interesting. It will probably change the statistics in America for race.
But if I would be afraid to say I was Middle Eastern. I mean, I
Yeah.
credibly claim that, but I wouldn't do it on the census because who the hell knows what, right?
I'm actually surprised there's not some sort of uproar about Middle Eastern now being categorized, but a lot of people probably don't know yet.
They don't
But
know.
I'm surprised about that. And even with my husband, I hesitate. You're supposed to write you write check, we check Mexican, whatever, and then we check Caucasian, and then you're supposed to put the countries of origin. And
Oh
I'm
my
even
God.
like, that's on the census. That's the census you filled out.
Wow. Oh my God, that is really frightening.
And
Woo.
so I'm always hesitant. Like, a lot of people probably don't fill it out fully, anyway.
No,
But
Stephanie has her hand up.
go ahead,
say,
Stephanie.
I've worked on the census.
Oh, go ahead.
I have worked on the census, and the census, I don't know, I can't verify now how it's going to be, but it is supposed to be secret. Your answers are not supposed to go to anyone. No one's supposed to see your answers. And no, all of your information is supposed to be, or what is it when it's all glommed together? There's a word for it.
Conglomerated.
Say again?
No.
Not
No,
quite.
It's Stephanie. It's aggregated.
No,
Egg.
I'll think of it and I'll send that again.
Anonymous? I don't know. Your
No,
name's
it's
on
not.
it.
Well, it is anonymous, but it's the. I'm sorry, I'm having a blank here. But your individual information is secret. It's not is anonymous. It isn't. Nobody can go in and see what you wrote about yourself. So you don't. No. You the way it's gathered together. That is the way it is.
Stephanie, this is only for a period of time because every so many years they unlock a differences. I think now it's up to, is it 1950? Jennifer, I see you nodding your
I think
head.
it's 70 years or something like that. 70 years until it.
1950 census is just being published.
You mean for
all the census up to 1950 are published.
For individuals?
They're no longer.
Really? For individuals?
Yes.
Yeah. Like I can look up my grandfather and see that he lived. I have that information. I have that information.
And say, in this address, in this street, in this house,
yes.
I want to know who lived. And they would say, oh, Stephanie Roth lived there, and she was 53, and she had 5 kids.
And she was white or black.
Caucasian, that religion, and they were that money. So everything that you put in becomes available, but it's 70 years.
They assume you'd be dead by then.
Right. So
But the thing is,
well, be dead in 70 years.
It doesn't matter for Jewish person, we always have a little bit of Jewish paranoia, right?
We do.
Yes. So
yes, but
of course we worry.
Census, everyone has paranoia who is different.
Right.
A lot of different people who don't fit into the picture that many Americans have of who the average American is. And none of us fit that description.
And so what I was going to say is if they look 70 years ago, my grandfather, it doesn't say, I don't think it said the religion back then. I don't know.
No, it religion. It had.
Yeah. So, but for some, yeah, right. So
there's another issue.
I mean, the Jews would have a heart attack if they put religion on the census. We would never do it,
I think it's important that people know if you're concerned about what you say in the census, that even with data that's made anonymous, there are various ways to use anonymous data from various sources, put it together, and use high-level computers. You might even call it AI. And by putting the little piece here that's anonymous with a little piece there and another piece in someplace else, and know exactly who is putting all the information together. Well,
Google
basically
already knows.
triangulating. It's like triangulating. You get a little bit here and a little bit there. You find the intersection, and and it's possible to have all the
We're
details
getting off
on
the
person.
topic.
I don't know about the census, but there's a big issue with medical data, and people are concerned about it.
Manny, thank you very much. It is 9 o'clock.
Oh,
And I'm going to, okay, one moment. Stephanie, you want to say something?
no, I said I move that we say goodnight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Okay.
Thank you. If Manny does
Alicia,
another talk, I'll be interested.
okay, Alicia,
Okay.
thank you so very much. I mean, Jennifer, thank you so very much for being
Thank
here
you.
this evening. Your generosity, your engagement, very enjoyable. Thank
And
you.
how come
Yeah,
your
thank
father
you.
wasn't on?
My
Thank
father,
you, Jennifer.
thank you.
so much.
Nice
That
meeting
was
all of
really
you. I hope to see you in
fascinating.
Florida.
Lovely.
I hope so too.
Great.
Take care.
Okay, well,
Bye.
good night, everybody. Thank you for
Good
coming.
night. Thank you, Previn.
Okay,
Okay.
good night.
What a
Good
great
Shabbos to
service.
everybody.
Good Shabbos, everybody.
Good
Shabbos.
Shabbos, that's Ashkenazi, Shabbat Shalom, that's Mizrahi.